On a cold November evening, Sarah and Jack Preston sat in their suburban home, the fire crackling softly. The couple, married for 5 years, had reached a point of stagnation in their relationship. What once was passion had cooled to routine, leaving them both yearning for something more. The wife swap fantasy was Jack's idea, whispered late one night when the couple admitted their mutual dissatisfaction. At first, Sarah was hesitant, but eventually, curiosity and the allure of rekindling their spark overpowered her reluctance. They found another couple, friends of friends, who seemed perfect for their experiment. What began as a playful, consensual arrangement would soon spiral into something far darker than either could have imagined. Sarah's initial nervousness gave way to excitement when the arrangement began. She was paired with Michael, a tall, charismatic man who exuded confidence, while Jack spent time with Michael's wife, Lily. The encounters were thrilling, but as the weeks passed, Sarah found herself thinking about Michael more than was appropriate. A line had been crossed when she and Michael began meeting in secret, outside the agreed-upon parameters of their fantasy. Michael, a manipulator at heart, fed on Sarah's vulnerability. He whispered promises of a life together, spinning fantasies of leaving their spouses behind to pursue what they convinced themselves was love. Sarah, overwhelmed by a mixture of guilt and obsession, felt herself losing control. Jack remained unaware, still caught up in the excitement of the wife swap, believing their marriage was better than ever. One evening, while Jack was out with Lily, Michael came to the house. This time, Sarah felt different, nervous and unsure. Michael had been growing possessive, his words no longer comforting but demanding. He insisted they confront their spouses, that the deception end. Sarah hesitated, knowing Jack wouldn't understand. But Michael was done waiting. His obsession had grown into something darker, something dangerous. It was in the heat of an argument that the truth finally unraveled. Jack came home early, finding Michael in their living room with a wild look in his eyes and Sarah sobbing on the couch. The confrontation turned violent. Jack, enraged at the betrayal, lunged at Michael. Fists flew, and Sarah's screams echoed through the house. But it wasn't until Michael, in a fit of rage, grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and struck Jack across the head that the true horror of the situation became apparent. Jack collapsed, blood pooling on the floor as Sarah rushed to his side, pleading for him to wake up. Michael stood there, breathless, staring at what he had done. The reality of the situation sank in, and Sarah's obsession shattered into cold, terrifying clarity. This wasn't love. This was madness. As the police arrived, called by a neighbor who heard the commotion, Michael was already gone, leaving Sarah kneeling beside her husband's lifeless body, whispering apologies he would never hear. In the aftermath, Sarah was left to face the consequences of her actions. The wife swap fantasy, born out of boredom, had become an obsession that consumed them all, leaving a trail of betrayal, death, and shattered lives. The fire in the living room had died down to embers, much like the life she once knew, now forever changed. Weeks after Jack's death, the once cozy Preston home stood eerily silent. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, but Sarah remained isolated, lost in a fog of guilt and fear. The police had deemed the incident a tragic act of passion, charging Michael with manslaughter, but Sarah knew the truth went deeper. Her own role in Jack's demise weighed heavily on her, and the memory of that final night played on a loop in her mind. Michael had vanished without a trace. Despite an ongoing manhunt, it seemed he had simply disappeared, leaving Sarah alone with the wreckage of their affair. The police questioned her repeatedly, trying to understand why Michael had attacked Jack. Sarah lied, telling them that she didn't know why it had escalated so quickly. But deep down, she knew she had fueled the obsession that led to that fatal moment. Nights were the worst. Every creak and shadow in the house sent her heart racing. She couldn't escape the feeling that Michael was still watching her, lurking in the shadows, waiting to finish what he started. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares of Jack's bloodied face, and Michael's cold eyes staring back at her. One evening, as the sky darkened into twilight, Sarah noticed something unsettling. Objects in the house, small, insignificant things, had been moved. A picture frame on the mantel tilted slightly, a drawer left open when she knew she'd closed it. At first, she tried to convince herself it was her imagination, the result of exhaustion and stress. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Then, the phone calls started. At odd hours of the night, her phone would ring, but when she answered, there was only silence. Sarah's heart pounded with every call, knowing who it could be, yet terrified of hearing his voice again. One rainy night, a loud knock startled Sarah from her restless sleep. She froze, staring at the front door. Whoever was outside didn't leave, continuing to knock rhythmically, as if they knew she was there. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She tiptoed to the window, pulling back the curtain ever so slightly, and saw a figure standing in the shadows, a tall, familiar shape that made her stomach drop. It was Michael. He had come back. Panic set in, But she couldn't move, couldn't think. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions: fear, anger, a twisted sense of longing. She wanted him gone, but a part of her, the part that had once been so drawn to him, needed answers. Why had he come back? What did he want from her? Summoning the courage she didn't know she had, Sarah opened the door, the cold air rushing in. Michael stood there, drenched from the rain, his eyes wild and desperate. He didn't look like the confident man she had once been infatuated with. He was broken, just as she was. "I had to see you," he whispered, stepping inside before she could protest. Sarah backed away, her pulse racing. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "You've done enough." Michael ignored her, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected Jack to walk out at any moment. "You don't understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did it for us. We can still be together. Jack's gone. We can be free now." Sarah's stomach turned. "Free," she spat. "You killed him, Michael. There is no us anymore. You destroyed everything." But Michael shook his head, stepping closer. "No, Sarah. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. But now we can be together. You said you loved me. You said you wanted this." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she realized how far gone he was. What had once been a fantasy had warped into a dangerous delusion. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I never wanted this." Michael's face twisted in anger. "You're lying. You can't say that now, not after everything." Sarah backed up further, her mind racing for a way out. She knew there was no reasoning with him. His obsession had completely consumed him. He wasn't going to leave, not willingly. And she knew, with a sudden flash of terror, that if she didn't do something, she might not survive the night. As Michael reached for her, Sarah acted on instinct. Grabbing a heavy vase from the table beside her, she swung it with all her strength. The vase shattered against Michael's head, sending him crashing to the ground. He lay there, stunned, blood trickling from his temple. Panting, Sarah didn't wait to see if he would get up. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she told the operator what had happened. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours before she heard the sirens wailing in the distance. When the police arrived, Michael was still on the floor, unconscious but alive. Sarah stood trembling as they led him away in handcuffs, his eyes burning into hers with a promise of unfinished business. As the officers asked her questions, Sarah could barely hear them. Her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the realization that this nightmare was far from over. Michael might be gone, but his obsession would haunt her forever. The fantasy that had once promised excitement and escape had turned into a living hell, one she could never truly escape. Months passed after Michael's arrest, and though the house was quieter, the silence felt suffocating. Sarah had tried to rebuild her life, but the weight of what had happened remained. Jack was dead, and Michael was in custody, awaiting trial for Jack's murder. But despite his absence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was still trapped in a web of her own making. The trial had become a media sensation, and Sarah's every move was scrutinized. Reporters camped outside her house, eager to capture any glimpse of the woman whose life had become a twisted tragedy. The courtroom was packed on the day Sarah was called to testify, her heart pounding as she faced Michael once again. He looked different, smaller somehow, his once sharp features now gaunt. But his eyes were the same, burning with an intensity that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. As she took the stand, Michael never looked away, his gaze drilling into her as she recounted the events of that fateful night. The prosecutor guided her through the questions gently, allowing her to tell her side of the story. Sarah spoke of the affair, of the fantasy that had spiraled out of control, and of the moment everything changed. Her voice trembled as she described how Michael had shown up that night, how his obsession had consumed him, how she had struck him to save herself. When the defense attorney approached, however, the tone shifted. He tried to paint Sarah as the instigator, suggesting that she had led Michael on, that her lies had driven him to madness. The insinuations clawed at Sarah's already raw nerves, but she held firm, denying the twisted narrative being spun around her. "I never wanted anyone to die," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted this. Jack, he didn't deserve this. None of us did." The defense attorney pressed harder, but Sarah didn't falter. When she stepped down from the stand, she felt a strange sense of finality. For the first time in months, she felt like she had taken back some control of her life, no longer a victim of circumstance, but a woman who had survived unimaginable loss. The trial dragged on for several more days, the jury deliberating for hours on end. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was thick with tension. Michael was found guilty of second-degree murder, and as the sentence was read, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of release. It wasn't joy, but a grim satisfaction that justice in some form had been served. But as Michael was led out of the courtroom in chains, he looked back at her one last time, his eyes dark and full of promises. Sarah shuddered. Even with him locked away, she knew he would always be a shadow in her life, a ghost haunting her from behind prison bars. The months turned into a year, and though the world had moved on, Sarah struggled to find peace. She sold the house, unable to bear the memories etched into every corner, and moved to a quieter town, hoping to leave the past behind. But on quiet nights, she would sometimes hear the phantom echoes of that last knock at the door, the memories refusing to fade entirely. Sarah knew she would never fully escape what had happened. Michael's obsession had left scars deeper than the court could ever see. In her new town, Sarah began to rebuild, piece by fragile piece. She enrolled in therapy, distanced herself from the media frenzy, and tried to reclaim her identity from the wreckage of her old life. And though the nightmares still came, though Jack's absence was a wound that would never fully heal, Sarah learned to live with the weight of her choices. The wife swap fantasy, once a thrilling escape from her dull marriage, had morphed into a living nightmare, a cautionary tale of desires unchecked and boundaries crossed. It was a part of her past now, a dark chapter in a life that she hoped, someday, might have room for light again. But no matter how far she ran, she knew the truth: some fantasies, once unleashed, can never be contained. And the price of that knowledge was far greater than she had ever imagined.